Hi, and welcome to the When Women Fly podcast. Each episode, I have poignant conversations with women who fly, run, surf, ski, climb, or otherwise soar, and possess a passion for life that is infectious. These are honest and insightful conversations about dreams and reinvention, often in the face of uncertainty, doubt, or other impediments. We talk about busting paradigms, grit, working hard, and playing hard, all while building a community around the empowering metaphor of flight. I am your host, Sylvia Winter, a pilot, runner, mother, skier, list maker, and apparently podcaster. I believe that when we share our stories, own our fears, and dismantle our perceived limitations, the possibilities are boundless. Whether you're pursuing your passion or simply love the idea of possibility and wonder, this podcast is for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let's get started. Joining me today is Enid Otun, first female chief pilot in Nigeria in the 90s. She is a generous, funny, and inspiring soul who shares many dimensions of her life story with us. She talks about the experience of working as a woman in a man's world, the ups and downs of blazing trails, her mental health struggles, and her reckoning with her past that lead to transformation in personal and professional realms. Enid's story is one of achieving hard things, being an only, being a first, showing up, doing the hard work, and never letting anyone say she couldn't do something. In fact, like many of my guests, those that undermined her accomplishments and successes fueled her conviction to do that very thing, and much more. Enid spent her formative years between Nigeria and the UK, where she now lives with her wife, her daughter, her dogs. She's not defined by traditional categories of race, gender, or anything else as far as I can tell. Please enjoy my conversation with Enid. Enid, it's such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh gosh, it's a pleasure. I'd love to get right into your story, hear the background of your life in your early years.
Where to begin? Well, I was a child of the 60s, born in the early 60s, 1962. My mother was English, my father Nigerian. Most of my growing up in the early years actually in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, this was just after Nigerian independence, which was in 1960. It was a difficult childhood, I have to say. It was a very traumatic childhood. My father was a very abusive man, but he was a very powerful man as well. So therefore, kind of everything went under the radar. And in the 60s, we didn't have the protections perhaps that we have today. I lived with this trauma until my father died when I was 12. And I was left kind of in a vacuum. I was kind of left not quite realizing who I was or what I should be doing. And I had, unfortunately, at the time, very little support. My mother was also traumatized. So she was limited in the help that she could give me. About a year later, I was sent off to boarding school in the United Kingdom. That was difficult in itself as well, because now I was away from what family I did have, thrust into a regimented, almost regimented style regime. I'm making it sound bad. It wasn't. It was just that I was unused to having that amount of people around me for at that young age, particularly when I hadn't had a normal childhood. I was lost. I was adrift for much of that time in boarding school. Up until I was around about 16 or 17, I had still had no idea what I was gonna do. But a chance meeting, a chance visit to an air show kind of set me on a path that I had no inclination that I was gonna go down in the first place. I was fascinated by aviation in a way because I was always traveling back and forth on holiday. I decided to go to this air show, and I got a chance to have a pleasure flight, which in those days were half-hour flights, where they kind of introduced you to flying really and to sightseeing and things like that. And I was lucky enough to have as my pilot that day a co-pilot who worked for the airline that had a route between Lagos and London, British Caledonian. He said, "Would you like to have a little go?" And I was, "Oh, this is not really my thing," even though I was slightly enjoying it. And I did, and, luckily for me, he took an interest in me, and before he let me walk away, he said, "Enid, that was fantastic." He said, "I've never seen that kind of from someone so young," he said, "that you need to investigate that." And it was the first time I really had had somebody who had shown me that they believed in me, kind of saw something in me, because up until that point, I'd never had that. It was always, "You're silly, you're stupid, you'll never do anything with your life, you're." I took it and I ran with it, and I didn't really know quite how I did, in fairness. When I look back now, I'm not sure what the what the trigger was, but clearly it was something that I felt that I could do, and gave me strength, and that's how it started.
And you didn't have anybody in your family who had been a pilot or was encouraging you, or was anyone discouraging you?
They weren't discouraging me. I think in those days, and we're now talking the mid to late 70s, women still weren't involved in a big way in aviation.
Mhm,
To my knowledge, there were no female pilots, private pilots or otherwise, in the it's certainly in Nigeria. In the UK there were, but, I didn't know any of them. But when I went back to Lagos, and I was told there was a Lagos flying club at the main airport, I thought, "Wow, that's interesting." And interestingly, it was my uncle. I had an uncle who was in the Air Force. He wasn't a pilot.
mm,
But he said, "Look, why don't you go down there and have a look, and see what you feel?" And my mother was supportive. I kind of was drifting. I wasn't doing anything. I didn't know where I wanted to be, or she thought, "Well, maybe this will give you some direction." And that's how it started. So the only encouragement was my uncle, very briefly at the very beginning. But after that, it pretty much was just, I picked up my own speed and my own momentum and just ran with it.
and were you challenged with air sickness or other challenges? The math, the science, I feel like I've heard you mention that. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think the days that I flew between, as an unaccompanied minor, I think they used to call them, on the flights, between
With
countries,
your tag
with
on,
my tag on, the
probably.
bright
Right.
red tag on my. And it was fantastic. I enjoyed the attention because, in fairness, it was the only time that I got any attention on me. I was horribly sick, and absolutely every bit of turbulence, I just flinched and hated it. When I was kept busy
Mhm.
by people, I was okay, but flying was not my thing. It was not my thing. I was not a happy child when I had to go back and forth. I suppose I got used to it in the end, but I certainly couldn't see myself doing anything like.
So you had a different feeling when you were pilot in command or in training.
It was almost like a new understanding, and also, I think a lot of it was about the fact that I was in control.
Mhm,
I think a lot of these things, when you first start off with things, it's like driving, isn't it? You're sitting in a passenger seat and somebody's driving, and regardless of how they're driving, if you're not used to it, you're kinda like, "Ooh, ooh, yeah, okay." But when you're driving, you're in control,
mhm,
and you're making those decisions. I think what happened fairly early on was that I'd kind of, almost in that small fragment of time when I had that pleasure flight, I'd proven to myself that I could actually do it, and I didn't feel afraid because I was concentrating, I was focused on what I was doing, and I think that's the attitude I took when I started my private pilot's license course.
mhm.
I'll be honest with you, yes, I was scared. Yes, I did feel fear. I think as everyone does. I mean, even if you're madly in love with aviation, and there's so many things that you have to get over. But I did do it.
Absolutely. And let me ask you something else about that time. During that stage of life is when we sort of start to develop our identity, and you were really straddling between Lagos. Was it Cumbria at that time?
Yeah, I was actually in Kent, in just outside London, yes.
Regardless, right? Two very different
Mm,
sets of identity, and you're mixed race as well.
yes.
So how did you start to grapple with that as far as your sense of identity?
I always struggled with my sense of identity, actually. I guess not so much because I was mixed race, because there was so much else going on in my life as well.
Mhm,
I was never settled enough to develop that identity.
mhm,
They say the years 1 to 7, I think, are the important years in a child's life where they develop character, and it's kind of set. It starts to become set. And because I was so traumatized at the time, I didn't have a sense of myself.
mhm,
With regard to being mixed race, I think when I went to different schools in Lagos. So I went to a British High Commission school, which was quite a relaxed kind of environment, and then I was put in a strictly Nigerian school, which is totally different vibe, and had totally different belief system, and
mhm.
there was all sorts of differences. I struggled with trying to understand whether I was truly black or truly white,
Mhm.
and I couldn't I somehow couldn't marry the 2 together either.
Mhm.
I did struggle with that. I had no idea who I was. I really didn't understand myself at all.
Mhm.
It was almost like I was somebody on the outside looking in. I was living my life, but from afar, if that makes any sense.
So at some point, you started committing more to the training part of your dream,
Mm,
and how what was that transition? And you did come to the US at some point.
mhm. I completed my PPL just after my 18th birthday. The chief pilot, the chief instructor at the time of the Lagos Flying Club said, "Look, this is really good for you. I think you can make a career out of this, and I'd like you to go to our sister facility over in just outside San Francisco. This is the Airline Training Institute in San Mateo,
Okay.
and I'd like you to see if you can, to the commercial perspective, go and push yourself and see what comes out of that. And if you've a mind to, go train to be an instructor and come back here and teach if you'd like to do that as well." So
Hmm.
I was buoyed by that because not only had I managed to get through 40 hours of a PPL, which was something I had never seen myself being able to do. These were things that were new to me. These were achievements that were new to me, and it wasn't natural to me. I always failed my exams. I always didn't understand my classes. I suppose it wasn't that I didn't, I just didn't know how to.
Mhm.
But this was something that I felt, wow, gosh, this PPL is in my hand. These hours are in my logbook, and I must have done that, and I passed the exams.
Mhm. And you are a private pilot. That was the very first big step.
It was the first big step, and that was a very, very important step for me, and I thought, "Well, what's the worst that could happen?" I did kind of take a step back initially because I was so young. I was 18. I hadn't traveled other than between the United Kingdom and Nigeria. The US was this huge place which you would only watch on television. You see fragments of the United States on television, and it was everybody wanted to be there, everybody wanted to go there. And I thought, "Ooh, okay, well, I'm going there. It's just gonna be me." But then, I kind of reasoned in the way that I reasoned in those days was that I'd done this up until this point, so
Mhm.
it was just gonna be in a different place. I mean, I don't remember my exact mindset, but yeah, like any 18-year-old, you'd be you'd be like, "Ooh, I've gotta go do this and achieve something and not fail."
Mhm. And so were they endorsing you? Were they sponsoring you over there? And sort of the expectation no, no, they weren't. Okay.
No, they didn't. They, obviously, they recommended me,
Mhm.
school, and the school said, "Yeah, absolutely," but,
Mhm.
we paid for it, my mother did, and,
Mhm.
it was certainly worth doing, and she felt at that time, I mean, she didn't speak to me about it. This was the whole thing. We had this kind of fractious relationship because we hadn't known how to relate to each other for the last 18 years. In snippets of conversations, it was like, "Yes, yes, do that," because I know she was proud of me, but she wanted me to find my way, and this seemed to be the avenue down which I would find my way.
Mhm.
And so she did encourage me in her own way, but the rest I had to do for myself. And, that's not to say that people weren't looking out for me. They definitely were. When I first arrived in the States, they were looking out for me. That I think I was their first foreign student who was female. So that was another first for them. And they didn't quite know what to do with me. They thought, "Oh my gosh, where do we put a girl?"
Mhm.
I eventually stayed with one of their engineers and his wife, and they were just absolutely wonderfully welcoming and nurturing and, all of those things that I actually needed for a for an 18-year-old in the US for the first time.
Mhm.
So there were people that popped in and out of my life and out of the next few years that would be looking out for me.
Mhm. And did you have a cohort there that you were studying with that you also became your support system?
When I first started, I kind of was in the first wave, I think, of foreign students that came over to do flying. A lot of the other students were quite mature. They're much older than I was. And they had already either started their careers or were part of the army or the air force, and they were out there doing various bits and pieces. At that time, he also, interestingly, had a 707 simulator on the premises, which was the one that was used to train the pilots who piggybacked the space shuttle in those days. There were a lot of students coming out there to because the 707 was the great jet of that time and still a favorite of mine.
Mhm.
So we had a lot of students like that. So I was kind of out on a limb because I was the only girl
Mhm.
and nobody it seemed to quite know what to do with, not in a bad way.
I understand.
Not in a bad way, just, "Oh my god, we've had, all the boys have been here before, and we could push them into a flat, 6 to a flat, but no, we've got to really look after Enid," because I wasn't sensitive. I was a tough cookie.
Right.
They felt that I needed that extra bit of support, and in many ways I did get that, so.
I've found that often in aviation that there's just a really supportive
Mm.
environment and community, and when you do walk in and you're the only, there's often sort of a curiosity of sort of this sort of odd situation, but not necessarily a negative. I mean, you do get the stray comments, but overall, I've actually been impressed and heartened by the sense of sort of support that you get by being a woman in a male-dominated industry. Now, you can tell us a lot of exceptions to that, but certainly I feel like in the training situation, in that environment, I found that in general, and more than I would have expected at least, there is a sense of certain nurturing when you walk in the door. And so how far did you get with your training in the States, and then what brought you back, I think, to Nigeria?
Yeah, I went the whole hog. I did the commercial license, the instrument rating, and the flight instructor's rating.
Mhm,
There I had my ups and downs. I settled it, I guess, after about 6 to 8 months, I settled into a rhythm. As I said, I had wonderful instructors. The owners of the institute then took me under their wing as well and were very, very kind and very supportive to me. Again, this was something that I didn't quite know how to accept in a way. I was just continuously shocked by people's kindness because, in fairness, I had not been shown kindness up until that point, and so I didn't really know what it looked like. And so I was struggling with a lot of that. I unfortunately through those next 3 to 4 years that I was there, not only did I have some wonderful opportunities and some wonderful training and wonderful instructors, but I did struggle with a loss of self-confidence. I struggled with believing in myself. I struggled hugely with my mental health. My mental health was failing at that point, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was now carrying 18 or 19 years of trauma that had not had an outlet and that I could not get rid of. And at the same time, I was trying to prove myself and I was trying to be the best that I could be, but I didn't quite know how to do that or what it looked like. I was struggling with all these different emotions and not really having an outlet for the support that I could possibly have done with at that time. And that wasn't anyone's fault. It was just because I was reluctant to talk about it because I felt that I'd be stigmatized.
mhm,
I felt that they would think, oh, she's got problems, so she's not going to make it. So I had to really try to bury a lot of these issues whilst I was trying to learn new things. But in fairness, I got through the commercial, I got through the instrument rating, which I struggled with on occasion, but I think a lot of that was my own self-doubt.
mhm,
I had wonderful opportunities like, flying for various people, and once I had my commercial license, when I did my instructor's rating, it all seemed to come together. There was something about now being in charge from the right-hand seat as opposed to the left-hand seat and having someone that relied on you that seemed to galvanize and kind of cement my belief in myself because whilst, there may have been many things going on in my life, I didn't suffer a lack of empathy for people. I understood that people suffered and that people struggled, and I had a good relationships with the students that were there, which was interesting, and we had our ups and downs together, which was fun. But it was when I got my instructor's rating, something changed for me. To this day, I don't know if I can put my finger on when it actually happened, but I just seemed to slot into place, and suddenly my own belief in my abilities came through. Not that I didn't have doubts, but I felt somewhat more anchored to what I was doing.
mhm,
I completed the training. I did a few bits and pieces in the US. I instructed there, so I got some good experience instructing, which I absolutely loved. And then I was offered a position as a first officer on a DC-8 in those days for a new startup airline in Nigeria, and everybody said, "Wow, this will be the first woman to go out and do this." And I thought, "Wow, that sounds great." I didn't know whether I was capable of doing it, but I was certainly going to give it a try. And so, reluctantly, I left my new US family, as I would always refer to them,
mm.
and returned to Lagos and, obviously went through the process of changing over my licenses. And unfortunately, in the meantime, the job fell through. and didn't materialize. And that set me back for weeks. However, in the meantime, I went back to the Lagos Flying Club because they welcomed me with open arms. I started to get some experience that along with flight instruction, which was fabulous. It was good because it grounded me at that time. And then I was lucky enough to be. There was a little period in between when I went back to the UK because I then thought, right, nope, this has all failed. No, I'm not. This isn't going to work for me. And again, I kind of was set adrift, and I had no idea what I was going to do. And I kept sending out. This was after the job fell through, and I felt, wow, this isn't going to happen for me. And so all those doubts came flooding back. I came back to the UK, and I stayed with an old school friend, and I didn't really do very much. I was lost in
Mhm.
at one point, I attempted to join the Royal Air Force, and I thought, "Well, you know what? I'm not gonna fly. I'll just kinda do the military police or something like that," and that was I felt, "Okay, well, I can live with that." Unfortunately, I failed the exam by 1 point.
Oh.
That sent me careening off a cliff. I was so disappointed. I felt now totally
Mhm.
just when you reach rock bottom, you kind of pick yourself up, and believe it or not, I sent a letter to a company called Bristow Helicopters in the hope that they would recognize my US licenses, and they sent a letter back, and they said, "Go back to Lagos. We're going to interview you." So I went, "Oh, wow, okay." So off I went back to Lagos, and the rest is history. They interviewed me and offered me a job, and that started upward trajectory for me again.
You didn't fly helicopters?
I flew helicopters very, very briefly, but only in a training perspective. It was a helicopter company mainly, but we had a fixed wing division which ran Twin Otters in the main Lagos hub. I had a brief foray into helicopters and in actual fact was offered the full course.
Hmm.
The time I was offered the full course, I was just about to get my command on the fixed wing, and I thought, "Nah, I want this more." So no, I didn't I didn't actually get there.
Yep.
You know, it was fun to work for a company that had both. I did a lot of flying with the helicopter pilots, I just didn't become one.
So now you're back in Lagos, your confidence is restored, but you still haven't have you still sort of done the deep dive into the trauma and recovering from that afterwards?
Not yet, because I was joining a company that whilst the company was very supportive of having women on their staff and they gave me the exact same training, they didn't treat me any differently in the 80s. That was amazing to have the support of a company like that. But Nigeria wasn't quite ready for female pilot up front, regardless of whether they were in the left-hand seat or the right-hand seat. And I was gung ho. I started off as a second officer. I did all my training. Again, ferried back to the UK for my training
Mhm.
and then came back and was online and, wonderful stories that you'll probably hear in my podcast, which I can think they're wonderful stories now, but it was always a challenge. It was a challenge to have a female up front at the as I would put it, at the sharp pointy end. People weren't used to it, culture wouldn't accept it, and in the '80s, it was a man's world, and that was that.
Mhm.
And it didn't matter who championed you, it was the very people that surrounded you
Mhm.
who would often challenge you, and it would be women also that would challenge me and say, "Well, you're very lucky you've got a man up front there because otherwise, it wouldn't work so well." And you're like, "Aren't you supposed to support me?"
Wasn't there an instance when you sort of saved yeah, I love that story.
Yes, I was on one of our first sectors, and in Lagos, we have a lot of thunderstorms, and we had entered a thunderstorm, and we were holding just to wait to land, and we were struck by lightning. Now, it was also my first experience of being struck by lightning, and I looked at my captain, he said, "Oh, yeah, it's loud, and we've been struck, and we're good." And everything went fine. We landed quite safely. We briefed the passengers, et cetera, and on the ground, you can imagine the passengers literally couldn't get out of the aircraft fast enough. They literally were scurrying out, tripping over themselves, down the steps and all the rest of it. So my captain said, "Why don't you just hop down and just stand by the aircraft steps and just reassure the passengers that everything was okay?" So off I went dutifully and did that. And a lot of them had seen me before and knew me. But this older lady came up to me and grabbed me by the arm as she did, and she took me to one side. She said, my dear, wonderful. That's very good, wonderful, well done, well done. But you are very lucky you had a man up front because otherwise we would surely have died." And in this lovely thick Nigerian accent, and I was like, "Uh, thank you, I think." So it brought home to me that
Oh,
very
wow.
morning that
Yeah.
she was of a generation and a culture that even though we were as females together, it was never gonna be my place to be up front, and if I was given that opportunity to be up front, I would always have to have a man control whatever I did, because that was the cultural expectation that you would be submissive.
You were never going to be good enough for her, and you had to just not let that be part of
No,
the way you defined
no,
your own sense of worth.
absolutely.
So, incidentally, what do passengers feel when the aircraft is struck by lightning?
Well, for the most part, they there's a smell of burning and there's a huge sound. I mean, it is with us on our headsets, it's absolutely shocking. And I guess in my career, I've been struck by lightning maybe 4 or 5 times, and it's always the same thing as this nice smell of electrical burning, this just horrendous sound, which literally you're doing this with your headsets. You're just trying to, "Ooh, that was loud."
But it doesn't actually fry anything consequential?
We have had situations where it's put a hole in the front cargo bay.
Okay.
We've got what they call static wicks on the wings, which basically, well, all over the airframe. And the static wicks, what they do is they dissipate the energy because, of course, lightning is cloud to cloud or cloud to ground. And if there's something in between it, it'll go through that. And so what it does is it's just a burst of energy. And these static wicks are just, there's about 18 to 20 on an aircraft. And I've had a situation where I've been struck by lightning. I've had 18 of these things on my aircraft. When you get on the ground, they're all ash. So they all have to be replaced. But yes, it just dissipates the energy back out.
Like a lightning rod.
Yeah, like a lightning rod. So it's a sound and a smell of burning, basically.
Wow.
But other than that, it's a shock. It's a shock to the system, the passengers. I mean, on that particular flight, the passengers all ended up praying, screaming, crying, and all the rest of it at the same time. You get through it and you reassure them. And I think as long as they can see that you're not doing the same thing,
Mhm.
all will be well. But as I say, they certainly weren't. Most of the comments that I would get was, "You don't touch anything, do you?" Or, "What's your role up here? Is it just to support the captain?" And all that kind of stuff. Yes, it is, but not in the way you think.
And of course, you were in training, right? You were not, in their minds, right? You were not actually, right?
I was still in training in many cases when I was wearing 4 bars on my shoulder.
Mhm.
They would bypass me to go to the co-pilot who was male to ask for something or to get something approved. They just couldn't see, even though they could understand the level of seniority, they couldn't equate a female with that level of seniority. So they would bypass me.
Mhm.
And that happened for many years. But I was very, very well known in the industry for not tolerating that too well, putting them in their place in a way. But that took many years. It took a lot of years before I guess people kind of thought, well, gosh, you are doing it. And, women were bankers and doctors, and these things started changing. And I think as other industries started changing, our industry started changing as well. But there was always that cultural element to it as well.
Yeah, and it takes time, and maybe generations to, completely.
It does, yeah, absolutely.
So at this point, you were very accomplished as a pilot, and were there still elements of your journey that were sort of pivotal in the way that you approached flying or sort of your personal and professional life?
I think for the most part, my I had enough battles to fight when I was actually flying. And so because I kept myself very, very busy and very, very structured and constantly on duty, it kind of detracted from what was going on in my life because, I was getting older. I was having to deal with certain issues, aggression, anger, self-doubt, all of those things that kept cropping up from time to time. And I realized
You can't keep running away, right?
you can't keep running away from those things, but I had no indication how I could actually address those issues. You weren't in a country in those days where you could actually perhaps go and see a counselor, for example. That wasn't the done thing, and they weren't available for you to do that. And although I had confided in a few, and I had very small circle of friends, and they were very good friends, but it was very difficult for them to help me because they knew me so well, if you see what I mean. And I still struggled, and I knew that elements of my trauma were impacting my career, not always in a good way. I think round about the age of 27, I don't know why it happened then. Life just kind of went on as it did, and I took every problem and I tried to deal with it, but whether or not I dealt with it correctly or properly, I wasn't certain. I had no there was nothing to measure it against. But I did know deep down inside that my traumatic past would always reflect on my career or anything I did in the future. So at some point, I had to make a decision whether or not to address it or whether to just see where it led me.
Mhm.
The one thing I did realize was that because my father had been abusive, I didn't take that on board as something that I had done to make that happen. I did feel that it was on him. It he chose to do this, or he proceeded to do this, but that it wasn't because I had done something to make it happen. And I think that was a very important distinction for me when I was younger. And I think part of that was because I was so determined. I was so determined to change my life. I was determined to make a difference. I was determined to get there one way or another, whether I knew what I was doing or not.
Mhm.
I was determined to do that, but I was also determined at fairly early on to not be a victim.
Mhm.
I did not want to be a victim. But for me, it was very, very difficult to kind of construct that part of myself without having someone to address. And I could not address my father because he was dead.
Mhm.
So I did the next best thing. At the age of 27, I came back from a very long set of flights and I got in the car to go home. And I thought, no, I need to say something to someone. And the only person I could say that to was my father. So I drove to the cemetery. I eventually found where he was. And, I sat there for 2.5, 3 hours and had a conversation with my father, which I had never, ever had before because I had never been given that opportunity to have a conversation with him. Not even as a child. I couldn't sit and talk to him. But I was determined that I needed to make that link. I needed to make that link between me saying, "Listen, I'm not going to be a victim, and I am going to forge forward with my life, and I am going to achieve what I want to achieve. Whether I fail, whether I don't, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that I'm going to do it, and I'm determined.
Mhm.
But I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to lay those ghosts to rest." It didn't solve all my problems.
Mhm.
But what it did do was it gave me that pivotal jumping off point, which said, I will not be a victim.
Mhm.
From this point on, I will do what I have to do to forge ahead
Mhm.
and continue to be determined. And whatever comes out of that, I will have to deal with.
Mhm.
For some reason, this, instead of being a negative event, I was angry, I was upset, I was all of those things. Instead of being a negative event, it was a very positive event for me, and I always use that particular event to start off where my life trajectory was going back up.
Mhm.
Now, it went like this, it was in waves, up and down as life is, but somehow I related to that. Instead of being adrift,
Mhm.
I was now back in port and able to structure not only my working life, which I felt was structured, but my personal life.
Mhm.
At least I would be able to deal with certain things.
Mhm. It's as if the taking command that one has to do as being a pilot, you had held off doing that entirely in your personal life, and then at this point, you just really needed to take command and take ownership of your past, right?
Yes.
It sounds like it was just extremely liberating to be able to then start, right? Have your new beginning with starting to really unwind that trauma. And you mentioned in one of your own episodes that you sometimes feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as if sort of these two alter egos, whether it's
Mhm.
sort of the private and the public, or sort of the good and the evil. You can interpret that in a lot of different ways, but I'm wondering what that means to you, or what that meant to you when you said that.
I think the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was the fact that I was two halves of the same person. And for me, I would be perfectly okay and able to get on with my life and do all the normal things that everyone else did. And then inside, I would be incredibly aggressive towards myself. I would batter myself in a way. I would continuously tell myself I was stupid. I couldn't do this. I would thwart myself
Mhm.
in many cases. I would almost try to prove to myself that I was useless and I couldn't do these things. It also expressed itself in a physical manifestation as well, because I was very not aggressive to people per se, but I was almost bent on hurting myself.
Hmm.
It was almost that I felt that by experiencing pain, I would suffer some. It would either help or hinder. I had to punish myself,
Mhm.
and the way I punished myself was punching things or kicking doors in or things like that.
Mhm.
And when I look back on that, I think, "Wow, was that really me?" But in actual fact, it was 2 sides of me. It was that part that hadn't been addressed and the trauma that hadn't been addressed, reminding me that it was still there.
Mhm.
And it was the public perception of me, because obviously as a pilot, I had to have it together, and I did. I did pull it together, and I was always in control. It was almost a way of saying, "Well, you've got from A to B, and you've done it extremely well. Now I'm gonna tear that down. I'm gonna tear that down. I'm gonna completely tear that apart, and I'm gonna punish you for doing that."
Mhm.
And it wasn't anyone doing it to me. It was my own mind splitting into 2 and saying, "Yeah, okay, you've done that, but now I'm gonna tear it apart."
It's sort of the post-traumatic trigger that sort of prompted you to be in this fight, and whether that was an external trigger or, internally, that was that until you really dealt with the trauma itself, that it seems like that would come up.
Absolutely right. Yes, it could either be, I mean, a lot of it was triggered by me. Anything that was external was maybe some of the things that I was going through at the time, the difficulty with fitting in, with people accepting me, but I was determined. There was a part of me that was determined to make it happen regardless of what anybody thought. But at the same time, I almost always questioned it.
Mhm.
And I would come home and I said, "No, they are right," you know? So that was that Jekyll and Hyde kind of relationship that I had with myself. And again, the difficulty of not really understanding why I had that. I knew it shouldn't be like that, but I didn't have any means to address it.
Mhm.
My mother was there and I did have a relationship with her, but it was a fractious relationship. We were 2 totally different people, and we had been separated through my school years and through my training years. And it was almost like we came back together but we were just it was always really fractious, and it was a very, very difficult relationship.
Mhm.
Maybe part of me blamed her for a lot that went on and why I wasn't protected.
Mhm.
Why didn't you protect me? I mean, years later, I know why, because she was suffering the same thing.
Mhm.
It was very difficult at that time to put that in perspective and to form that relationship with my mother, and that didn't happen until many, many, many years later.
Mhm.
And even then, it was still fractious. So, and
Complicated.
complicated is the word, yeah.
Yep. There's a concept, and I mentioned this to you earlier, developed by Tedeschi and Calhoun over here in North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina at a center called the Boulder Crest Institute of Post-Traumatic Growth. And they've come up with this concept of post-traumatic growth. I've just, having talked to you and learned more about your story, I really interested in how you reflect, these 5 parts of post-traumatic growth that they refer to, that is not universal. Not everyone has this sort of positive transformation after trauma. They mention that it's marked by people who develop a new appreciation of life, a newfound personal strength. They see improvement in their relationships. They see new possibilities in life and undergo spiritual changes. I think it's really interesting to think about what helps one support that growth. And certainly there must be, it's just sort of internal factors, but there maybe also be external factors. I just wondered how you related to that concept.
Many different facets of that for me.
Mhm.
I think a lot of it was my determination as a person that I wasn't gonna be a victim. That was always a mantra in my head, regardless of how I used to punish myself. There was always a mantra in my head that you are not gonna be a victim. You are not gonna be like your father. You are gonna make a difference. You can do this. It sounds like I didn't have any support at all, but I did
Mhm.
in bits and pieces. And there were people who came in and out of my life who brought something to my life which encouraged me to continue on that path and to continue striving to be the best I could be, and who continuously encouraged me. One of those important people in my life was a captain that I used to know called Chris Puddy, and he features in one of my podcasts. We flew together a lot and we had a synergy. It was incredible. He was just such a gentle man and he believed in the spiritual, and he introduced me to that, which up until that point I'd had absolutely no time in my life for.
Hmm.
I felt that God had abandoned me a long time ago and he certainly wasn't coming back to rescue me or find me. So that spirituality was not part of my everyday existence.
Mhm.
But neither did he try to change me. He listened to me, he encouraged me, he supported me, not only from the flying perspective, but he would spend many hours talking with me, talking about various philosophers and things that would help me and crystal healing and all that kind of stuff that was alien to me.
Mhm.
But will always credit him, and he unfortunately passed away last year, which was very upsetting for me. But he had this incredible way about him. He was goodness personified. I don't know quite how to describe him. I did in the podcast,
Mm.
and I hope that I did his memory justice because he was instrumental. I didn't know that at the time because you don't always pick up on these things at that time. It's sometimes later in life that you look back and you think, "Wow, that's when that change happened."
Mhm.
So it was people like him, it was the determination that I had, and it was the relationships that I was starting to form at that time. I was finding that people were giving me the time of day. They were showing belief in what I was doing. These were things that I'd never experienced, and I was struggling and floundering, I think, to identify with things that I had never experienced as a child, because that I should have experienced as a child.
Mhm.
I should have experienced these things, but I never did. So there was this great void in my life,
Mhm.
and it wasn't that I didn't want to comply, or it wasn't that I didn't want to be a certain way. It was because I didn't know how to. I had no way of linking it with my childhood or things that should have happened.
Mhm.
I had no experience of it. And so my immediate response was, well, what's that mean? Or what is that? But gradually, as relationships started to be formed and I built relationships with people and proved to myself that I was doing something right. I think this built itself into a very positive element in my life.
Mhm.
I like to be a bit of a clown. I like to laugh. And what I had to do was I had to reach in to grab those positive little snippets
Mhm.
that were within my life and bring them out
Mhm.
and just say, well, hang on, that is a part of me. And it was by people saying, you're funny,
Mhm.
you make me laugh, and that kind of stuff, that things like that would grow my confidence.
Mhm.
But I think the overriding thing post trauma for me was the fact that I had lived with this trauma for 12 years of my life, and I had had no power and no control. Now I did have power and I did have control,
Mhm.
but I was going to use that as a force for good. No longer would anyone be in control of me. I could be in control of myself, and it was my choice. I had to make those choices. We all have choices.
Mm.
Whether we make good choices or bad choices depends on environment, circumstance, a whole load of things. But for me, my choices had to be the right choices for me first. Somewhere out of all of this, I wanted to be a good person. I wanted to be an empathetic person. I wanted to be a decent member of society. I wanted to be proud of what I had achieved in growing from that trauma. So to say that trauma can define people in different ways.
Mhm.
It can depress you or it can lift you up. It can be a bit of both.
Mhm.
I struggled with both of that. But for me, the overriding feature was that continued determination to not let this get out of control, to make those choices of my own accord, to seek what I needed to seek the help I needed, to seek the support I needed, and to make a difference,
Mm.
to not let that all be a waste.
Mhm. Oh, it's powerful. It's really powerful. Your story is moving, and I just so appreciate how honest and open you are. I think that you are making an impact, and
Thank you.
through your own podcast, which we'll mention later, but also just being here with me and in this space and being so open and just demonstrating that we can be vulnerable. And in fact, we sort of have to in order to really take our life and live our life in the way that shows the most promise.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you a couple maybe less heavy questions. Any book recommendations? I love to have.
I've read all sorts of books as I've gone through life, I think. Interestingly, and this might sound weird in a way, I went through a period of time in my late teens, right through to my early 30s, I think, where I would literally was reading Russian classics. And the reason I was reading well, I don't know quite how it started, but for some reason, I think I read the Brothers Karamazov, I think was one of the first ones. And I mean, these were big, beefy volumes of these are heavy going, but in them, I found an array of character. And I think I related to that rather than reading self-help books, for example. Those I never really did
Mhm,
because I felt that although I could be given that advice, I wanted it to be real. I mean, not that it wasn't real, it was just that I could never see myself applying things that people had set out in bullet form.
mhm,
Do this, and at the end, you should achieve this. I didn't really relate to that.
mhm.
So I picked up on the Russian classics and I must have, oh gosh, I must have read these things like, I don't know, time and time and time again, over and over and over again, getting getting characters' personalities and trying to envision what they were going through and why they were going through it. So it was almost a way of dissecting this author's writing
Mhm.
and looking at these very, very powerful characters, very powerful. In fact,
And complex.
oh, complex. Yeah, totally complex. Yeah. The more complex, the better.
Mhm,
But in a way, I related to that complexity of character,
mhm.
and I related it to the way I would respond to certain things, but it was done in a story form, so it didn't trigger any of the very traumatic issues perhaps I was still dealing with and didn't quite know where to put. I could relate it back to that story form so that it wouldn't be so overwhelming for me.
So interesting. It's sort of like it didn't ask much of you, right? So you could whatever were willing to go through in experiencing the novel and the characters and their, complex relationships, you could come you could bring that, but if it was too much for you, then you didn't have to go there.
I didn't have to go there. I could just gloss over whatever was happening. But if I wanted to investigate it a little more, I could reread that paragraph and I could think, okay, well, I can relate to that. So that was kind of how I related to the characters. And that was how it kept me really busy. It kept me very enthralled. It kept me focused, but it didn't overly tax my brain in that if by the same token I had read maybe self-help books, I would feel very compelled to change my life right there and then. I didn't work like that. My brain didn't work like that. I had to if I was gonna change, I was gonna change over time, and I was going to change at my own pace, but I was going to also dictate how that happened. But in using the perception of those characters and the environments and the scrapes and the mistakes that they made,
Mhm.
I could relate to that and say, "Oh, okay, well, I perhaps wouldn't have done it that way." But as you rightly said, they were complex. It was done in such a way that it didn't overtax my brain because I realized that if I did do that, then I would probably go backwards rather than forward. It was too much for me, and I had to take it. But yeah, I didn't think about that until very many years later when I realized that that was actually what was happening. I don't think I realized it at the time, even though I was doing it. I was in it.
Sure. It's sort of like we're hungry for exactly what we need,
Exactly.
and we might find out later what that actually was. Oh, that's so interesting. So last question I wanna just ask you, you may have already said this in one way, not directly, but if you had one thing that you wish you knew as let's call it sort of the period of time before your pivot point, what would that have been?
I think something very simple out there. I think for the first and the critical point for me is the first 12 years of my life. And I think if I had known that there was love and support out there somewhere, and that people, because you see, when I was growing up, I felt that everybody was going through this,
Mhm.
that everybody was. going through some element of this. Maybe not exactly what I was going through, but I felt that the world was a
Mhm.
very dark place, and that the people who were supposed to be looking after me were very dark people. They weren't full of light, or they were very changeable. And I think if I'd known that there was love and light out there, and I had some access to that, I think that would have changed, perhaps could have changed the way that I moved forward. I didn't have that knowledge because that was my norm.
Mhm.
We talk about trauma in a way, and we talk about, well, if you know this is happening to you, why don't you move away from it? Well, it's not that easy because that is your norm. Like happiness is someone else's norm, or support and love and a loving family is a person's norm. My norm was a very dysfunctional, dark part of my life,
Mhm.
dominated by characters such as my abusive father.
Mhm.
I think once that's your norm, you can't kind of peek out of the sides and to see if there's anything better. And I think if I could have done that,
Mhm.
if I'd had that opportunity, if I'd had someone in my life who could have taken me by the hand and taken me out of that, maybe not permanently, but on occasion had taken me out of that so that I could see the light. I could see what it was like to play and not to fear
Mhm.
and not to worry and all of this. If I could have had just a glimpse of that light in the darkness, I think that would have made a very big difference to my life.
That's a good thing for us all to sort of ruminate on. I think we could all pay back in one way or another, right?
Absolutely. Definitely.
Enid, how can we listen to your podcast and how else can we find you on social?
If Women Were Meant to Fly, The Sky Would Be Pink is available on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Android, and everywhere in between. We also have a website where the podcast is featured along with snippets of information of me and other bits and pieces. That's www.skyispink.co.uk. Our handle on Instagram, Facebook is at Pink Sky Podcast. That's all you have to Google or pop into Instagram, and there's loads and loads and loads of stuff about my stories. We have just finished the first season of the podcast, and the second season will begin next Sunday, where there will be more stories and ups and downs, if you forgive the pun, of my flying career and my personal journey as well.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely put a plug in for season 1. Enid is a wonderful writer, and her podcasts, they sound like a memoir sort of in motion. There's funny, they're witty, they're honest, and just a gift.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enid. This has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the When Women Fly podcast. My hope is that you leave this conversation with a sense of curiosity and empowerment to hold on to what is important and let go to what weighs you down. Stare fear in the face. If you like this episode of the When Women Fly podcast, be sure to share and subscribe and let us know what you think. We love feedback. Be brave, be bold, and fly. See you next time.